Today's topic is inflation during the war, inflation north and south. Of course, inflation is the scourge of society and economy in general. It's an economic poison, although it is often touted by economists as some kind of panacea, that we can just print up money and cure all ills. From my perspective and that of Austrian economics, inflation is a giant ripoff. The street view of inflation, so to speak, is that businessmen raise prices for profit and exploit the consumer, the citizen. But in the Austrian view, inflation has a definitive cause, which is government increasing the supply of money. Basically, you get too much money chasing too few goods, and the consequence of that is that prices rise in the economy. The quantity theory of money reverses the street view, in other words. And it shows that an increase in prices is the effect or the consequence of the action of governments and central banks. An important thing to note with inflation in general is that the people who first get their hands on the money benefit from inflation, and the people who end up getting the money last, so to speak, as it trickles down through the economy, are the ones who are essentially getting ripped off by inflation. So if you have your wealth or your portfolio in cash, accounts, CDs, bonds, fixed income, fixed retirement, fixed annuities, life insurance, things of this nature, you are going to be hurt most by inflation. Now, of course, in the Civil War, we're talking about a lot of inflation. Many, many times faster or more significant than we are experiencing today. And under those conditions, we see that some of the functions of money, and money is basically the medium of exchange. It's the product or good which we use to facilitate exchanges. But it also does other things for us. It acts as a store of value. So we can store up value over time in the form of savings, in the form of money itself. And when we see high rates of inflation, we see that this function of money, the store of value, being undermined. In other words, if we're used to storing our wealth in the form of money, and inflation is eroding that value, people start to find other ways of storing value in real, tangible assets, like their house. Money also serves as a unit of account. It's what we use to make the terms of contracts. So that baseball players' contracts are written in terms of dollars. Businesses, investment, all of these things are done in terms of dollars. And so we do our economic calculations about profits and loss in terms of dollars. And with high rates of inflation, that function of money deteriorates. Once both of those functions are completely undermined, usually entails a hyperinflation. Now, to set the stage, it's important, I think, for a number of reasons, to look at money and banking before the war. The U.S. Constitution basically took away the right of individual states or governments to print money and gave the federal government in the Constitution the power to coin money and to fix its weight. And so we had a kind of monetary union based on gold and silver coins in the United States prior to the Civil War. There were a couple of exceptions. The first and second national banks of the United States were periods where the federal government became more active in money and banking, causing two periods of big boom and busts or depressions in the economy. But from 1837 until the war, we had an era called the free banking era. So what we're going to be talking about here is inflation north and south. Going into the Civil War, we had the free banking era, where basically the federal government didn't have much involvement in money and banking, and most of the states had very little regulation or control over banking. You know, there's the general dichotomy that I've tried to draw. It's very much a generalization between North and South, where the North tended to be mercantilists, who advocated national banking, who advocated easy money policies, and was more or less pro-government debt. Where the South tended to be more hard money oriented, and they tended to be anti-bank or anti-paper money. And they were against, by and large, a large national debt. And the South was basically had the upper hand in the 2 decades before the Civil War in terms of banking, in terms of money, also in terms of trade. The tariff rates were coming down as we headed into the Civil War. So the South, in other words, had the upper hand going into the war. There was still some regulation in free banking states. By giving banks charters, state governments essentially gave banks a seal of approval. And banks could still issue unbacked notes, banknotes, that were not fully backed by gold and silver held at the bank. The result was, during this period, a period of high economic growth. Economic growth and prosperity was fully abundant in the United States. There were some panics, there were fluctuations, but by and large, with lower tariffs and basically unregulated, no involvement or very little involvement in money and banking, the United States was very prosperous. There's an interesting case study that I'll point out that's in the book about the Citizens Bank of Louisiana prior to the war. They had a law which required banks that if they were going to issue paper banknotes, that they had to back up every penny of those banknotes with 1/3 gold So if they issued $100 or say $300 worth of banknotes, they had to have at least $100 of gold inside the bank. The other 2/3 had to be backed with short-term securities. So that this bank and Louisiana banks in general were very liquid. They could always redeem their notes because they had plenty of gold on hand, and the rest of it was readily accessible. These short-term securities were basically loans for commodities. As commodities would come into New Orleans, and here we're talking about, of course, cotton, sugar, grain from the Midwest, cattle from the West, and so on. These were commodities which were readily sellable, and the debts could be rapidly repaid. So they weren't real estate loans or longer term loans. These things could be easily gotten hold of. As a result, the banknotes from Louisiana were very secure. They were, in a sense, as good as gold. Not quite as good as gold, but pretty good. As a result, the banknotes of Louisiana banks were widely circulated. You didn't have to worry about whether or not you could redeem them for gold as much as you would other banks. And as a result, people would be willing to take these banknotes and hold on to them. And as a consequence, the notes circulated outside of New Orleans. Even here in Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, the Ohio Valley, Kentucky, Arkansas, Texas, and so on. So they were widely circulated. And one of the most prominent banks, the Citizens Bank, was French-owned. And, of course, New Orleans was still a city where the French were a prominent part of the population, French-speaking people. And so their notes were written in both English and French. And so their $10 note you'd see the word 10 and the French version, DIX. As a consequence, the English-speaking people who accepted these notes referred to them as Dixies. And this is widely thought of as the source of the name Dixie, Dixieland, and, of course, the basis of the phrase that the South is Dixie and the song Dixieland. So that, money that was nearly as good as gold is essentially the basis of the famous song and the famous designation of the South as Dixieland. Now, getting back to the war itself, there's only so many ways we can finance war. And these ideas apply today as much as they did in the Civil War or going backwards in time from there. You can tax the economy or the population to pay for the war. You can borrow the money to pay for the war. Or you can print up the money via inflation to pay for the war. And you can also use direct taking of resources. And here we would look at things like conscription or the draft, the military draft, as a way of taking labor, and confiscation as a way of taking things like land, property, commodities, and so forth. And the key question in terms of a war is what mix of these means are you going to use to pay for the war effort? All four of these venues of raising resources have negative consequences on the economy. So there's no perfect way of financing war. There's no panacea of financing war. But some are worse than others. Taxes, I usually don't have much good to say about taxes, especially this close to April 15th. They do have flaws, but taxes are among the best ways of financing war. One of its biggest advantages is that the citizens know what the cost of the war is. And because they feel the burden of the war, it also places constraints on government to not take too many resources from the economy. Okay, so it provides that direct information between citizens and warriors about the cost of the war. Borrowing is also a preferable way of fighting a war, but it's best only under certain conditions. The best way that borrowing can be of use to you is to borrow money from foreigners and to purchase foreign goods and bring them into your economy to fight the war. That way it doesn't place any immediate drain on your economy, and it sort of extends the pain of the war into the post-war period. The problem here is, however, that if you're not expected to win or you're losing the war, it makes it more difficult to con foreigners into giving you their money and their products, okay, because they want to be paid back. And in terms of the North and the South not only had a lower probability of winning. I mean, the North was not going to go out of existence. The South did not intend to invade and destroy the North. It was the North that was invading and trying to destroy the South. So foreigners wouldn't be concerned about getting paid back by the North as much as the South. And also, many state governments in the South had defaulted on foreign debts prior to the war. So in the panic in the years around 1837, several states defaulted on their state debt. And as a consequence, foreigners did not look on the South as a good debtor. As a matter of fact, Mississippi was one of those states. And Jefferson Davis, of course, was from Mississippi. So the president of the Confederacy came from a state which defaulted on foreign debt. Conscription and confiscation are really bad. That's a system where you make the citizens upset about taking their resources. You're getting the resources from the local economy rather than the foreign economy. And government tends to take, if it's got the right to draft as many soldiers or to confiscate as much assets as it wants, then the tendency is for government to overdo it and to take too many resources. So conscription and confiscation is really bad. And then finally, inflation. Inflation is the easiest way of getting resources. You print up the money, very little cost to you, and you go about buying resources from the economy. So this is easy, but it also tends to be the most damaging form of revenue. Because inflation is infecting the price system in the economy, it's distorting people's ability to calculate, people's ability to make future plans, people's ability to establish enterprises and businesses, to make investments, to calculate, how much labor am I going to need, how much land am I going to need, how much capital am I going to need, putting that all together in order to, say, produce a warship or to produce a hospital or whatever that investment is that might be beneficial to the war effort. It makes it very difficult for entrepreneurs to calculate. And there's some stories in the literature about business people north and south finding themselves being diluted by inflation, thinking that they're making profits, but actually finding out after the fact that they really didn't make any money, that it was all an illusion of prosperity. So it distorts the private economy, and it also, because it's easy to obtain resources by inflation, it also encourages government to consume too much of the local resource base. In the North, they started out with a hard money policy. They were going to pay for government with taxes, and they were going to borrow money from abroad to pay for the war, and they were going to stay on the gold standard. So they had even though they were mercantilist in philosophy, they started out with a very hard money perspective on the war. They very soon found out, however, that they couldn't borrow as much money as they needed, so they went to the greenbacks, which is essentially the forefather of what we have today. The greenbacks, paper money. Very quickly, Gresham's law went into effect, and the paper money stayed in circulation and the gold money came out of circulation. If you had a choice between, say you, as a business you were getting some gold and some paper money into your store, and then you had to spend some of that money, chances are you'd spend the paper and hold on to the gold because you were worried about the paper money losing value. Well, sure enough, that was what happened on a massive scale. The gold left, the paper stayed, and it lost, over the course of the war, almost 2/3 of its value. Okay, so Northern money, greenbacks, lost at its peak 2/3 of its value, even though there was a promise to pay after the war, pay it all back in gold. Now, the general story, the impression that people had during the war that the rising prices, the greenback is falling in value, means that prices are rising, and so food, clothing, and shelter is more expensive. Generally, people, newspapers, and so on, blamed this on speculators and business people. In addition to higher prices, inflation in the North caused other effects. For example, there was more extravagant spending, there was more spending on luxury goods by people who were making a lot of money during the war. So there was a tendency towards extravagance and luxury in northern cities. Property values went up, which is typical during inflation. People wanted to invest in land, housing, things of that nature. Workers, or the labor force, was the most hardest hit. So if you were a teacher or a minister or not necessarily a factory worker, but farmers, people in the labor force were hurt the most because the prices were rising, but their wages didn't keep up with inflation. So, and this is typically the case, that workers are hurt by inflation. There was the illusion of prosperity. Everybody's money income was going up every year, so and this, of course, feeds into the luxury spending as well. Let me see here. I want to just briefly explain a section in the book that looks at how different schools of thought view the inflationary process. And then the book brings to bear the evidence of the Civil War to show how each of these groups can be interpreted. There's the Keynesian economists, there's the monetarists, or the Chicago School, and then there's the Austrians. And these are sort of the extreme views of these three schools, particularly the Keynesians and the monetarists. When trying to explain rising prices, the Keynesians emphasize real factors. In the extreme, they say it's all just real factors. So, in the Keynesian view, it was the war that was driving higher prices. The war effort on top of the regular economy increased aggregate demand and drove up prices. The monetarists, or the Chicago School, not surprisingly, emphasize monetary factors in the economy. The printing press. was responsible for inflation. In the extreme version, monetary factors account for all of the rise in prices in the economy. The Austrians define inflation not as rising prices, but as changes in the money supply or increases in the money supply. The mainstream of Keynesians, monetarists, and other schools of thought that have developed off of these two main branches look at inflation in terms of its effect. Or the price increases, whereas the Austrians look at inflation in terms of the cause, or increases in the money supply. So when it comes to explaining higher prices, when it comes to explaining the effect, the Austrians would view the Civil War both in terms of the real factors plus the monetary factors. So that inflation during a wartime, when the war is sucking out resources and destroying resources in battle, plus you've got the printing press going, when you want to look at what's causing the higher prices, you want to look at both of those aspects. More money and fewer goods. So, in terms of understanding the evidence that's presented there, in terms of the price levels that are calculated, in terms of the impact of battles and that sort of thing, sometimes called the psychological factors or the event factors, we want to include everything to explain those higher prices. Now, inflation in the South was much more severe than in the North. And I think that this goes a long ways to explaining the growing weaknesses in the Southern economy. I mean, we've already looked at the blockade and that sort of thing. But in terms of inflation, this poison that's injected into the economy by government was at a much lower rate in the North than it was in the South. The bulk of resources that the Confederate government used, it paid for with paper money. And so the Southern economy was totally disoriented by the effects of inflation. And they not only just pumped the money in, but they pumped it in at an erratic pace. And later in the war, they actually had a revaluation of the currency, so that Southerners didn't know what to do in terms of bonds and cash and investment and building projects. It was just a massive confusion. The amount of inflation was, in terms of the increase in the money supply went up by over 1,000%. In the North, it was much less severe. Their currency depreciated by 2/3. Of course, ultimately in the South, the Confederate currency depreciated to zero. Basically have a hyperinflation, they lose the war, and the currency becomes valueless. For those of you who are up in the reading, I just couldn't resist this quote from John Shelton Reed, a sort of sociologist of the South, that leads in this chapter, and I'll read it to you here. It was actually originally from an article that he published, but it's in the book Whistling Dixie Dispatches from the South, published in 1990 by the University of Missouri Press. In 1865, the Confederate dollar was a mere scrap of paper. But today, a Confederate $1 bill costs $8 of U.S. dollars. What accounts for the Confederate miracle? How can currency backed by a government defunct now for over a century be sounder than one backed by the government in Washington, D.C.? Confederate officials aren't sane, but they seem to have learned a lesson from the severe inflation of 1862 to 1865. Strict controls on the growth of the Confederate money supply, coupled with a fiscal policy that produces a balanced budget in every year. It's funny, but it contains a lot of wisdom. Actually, that quote contains all the wisdom governments need. If they have a balanced budget at an extremely low level in this case, and they have strict controls on the supply of money, in other words, there's no way they can increase the money supply, what you see is not an inflation system in terms of depreciating money, but something where even a scrap of paper unbacked by any government actually attains a rising value.
So, Mark, not having read that, what am I supposed to think when I see that Greenspan is still fighting inflation?
Well, George, the best advice I can give you in terms of Alan Greenspan comes from an article that I wrote about his testimony before Congress and what we should think about it. And I'll give you the title of the article. It's called Green Spam.
Was it the last 6 months?
Last year, green spam. And like email spam, you should not open it, but you should delete it. And that's basically what, unless you're particularly interested in dissecting his testimony and, finding out that all of his forecasts are wrong and all that his analysis is tilted to explain that everything he does is right and everything everybody else does is wrong, I would just ignore what he says.
What would you call him? A liar or a cheat or incompetent?
Maybe a Republican bureaucrat, which sort of encompasses all those things. Now,
hard on Republicans, Democrats, too.
Yes, I mean, I'm not trying to be one side or the other here, but he is a Republican. And Republicans tend to be mercantilists, support faster money growth, national debt. Now, of course, Greenspan has written that he thinks the gold standard is the way to go back in the 1960s. But, that's when he was, wasn't involved in politics. So.
Great essay. I remember that. I read it.
Yes. I mean, it's fantastic. He's basically explaining that inflation was a ripoff. Yeah. And it is a ripoff, and it was a ripoff here. But you can say more pragmatically, even if it's a ripoff, does it work? Does it really win a war? Can you win a war by out-inflating the other side? And the answer is no. You win a war by inflating less than the other side. Or not at all. Politicians might find that very difficult to do. But let's take a look at the evidence presented on page 75 in table 3.4, where we compare the mix of resources from the Confederacy, the Union government, the American Revolution, and the War of 1812. And we break down the financing in terms of loans, taxes, currency, paper money, and other forms of revenue. And what we find is that in the Confederacy, about 21% was in terms of loans, about 10.5% in terms of taxes, currency 61.7%, and other was 6.5%. The Union, on the other hand, took in almost 65% of its revenues in terms of loans, 16.5% in terms of taxes, 16.5% in terms of currency, and 2.5% by other means. The American side, during the War of the American Revolution, the U.S. America took in 29.5% in terms of loans, 8.8% in terms of taxes, 57.4% in terms of currency, and 4.3% in terms of other means of raising revenue. And this doesn't include the draft, of the issue of drafting labor. 1812, the U.S., 49% loans, 28.5% taxes, 16.3% paper money, and 6.2% other. Those would be...
Mark, in the war for 76 for independence, did the same thing happen in currency that happened to the Confederates?
Oh yeah, I mean the American currency during the Revolutionary War was initially started out 1-to-1 with silver coins. Gresham's law went into effect almost immediately. The silver coins went out of circulation. The paper money became the dominant form of money in circulation, and the value of the currency issued by the Continental Congress depreciated very rapidly, went into a hyperinflation, and became almost worthless during the later stages of the war. So, yes, I mean, that definitely goes into effect. And one of the things that really stands out here is that the Confederacy got the smallest percentage. And of course, these three are victories. And this is a loss. And we see that the Confederates had the lowest percentage of any of the four cases in terms of loans, followed by the American Revolution. Currency, they had the highest percentage, again, with second place being the American Revolution. So that the recipe, as dictated by economic theory, of relying on taxes and loans and avoiding inflation and confiscation and those sorts of avenues, really plays out in the American historical experience. And even if we were to look at 1776, with Continental Congress raising just a little bit more in terms of loans and inflating just a little bit less, you have to remember that, America did win that war, but they didn't win by much. The British were basically, in a sense, in control in a similar way that we're in control of Iraq. And what basically happened was that the British were feeling the pinch from elsewhere around the globe, and the French intervened on our behalf. So
there were more French troops at Yorktown than there were American troops.
Yes, that sounds about right. And of course, the fleet was very important. But so you have to recognize that 1776, we needed French intervention. Which, if you need French military intervention, it's a sign of desperation, right?
Something that confirms this. The French Revolution is based, or many people argue it's based on the fact that in helping us, the revolution, they ran up such a debt, such inflation, that the king had to call a parliament back and got kicked out.
Yeah, I mean,
it would be interesting to see what their rate of inflation was.
Oh yeah, I mean the French situation throughout that. I mean, going way back into the 17th century, even the financial situation of the French monarchy is not all that good. I mean, that's why they sold us Louisiana for the money. That's why they had the Mississippi bubble in France, because it was, John Law was trying to somehow pay off the debts of the French monarchy. And, the French situation in terms of their fiscal policy, and their public finance was desperate all the way through this period. And of course, what comes out of it is, it was so bad that people started thinking about these issues to such a great extent. In one case, the person that I'm doing research on, Richard Cantillon, in the aftermath of the Mississippi bubble, sat down and tried to figure out economic theory, and ultimately produced a theory of the business cycle and a theory of the market economy. And later on in France, again, you have the physiocrats dealing with these questions, and Adam Smith developing his response, and David Hume developing his response. Basically, they were all good responses. They were telling people like the British Parliament and the French monarch what to do. And it's just that the French monarch, in particular, refused the advice. They ended up canning Turgot as finance minister, and because they failed to reform themselves, they end up with a French Revolution. So, these are...
Well, European governments borrowed for a long time, a lot of wars for a long time, and they had to get that money somewhere, and a lot of it they got it from the other, call them gentry, or businesses, and they were heavily in debt. All of them.
Yeah.
And it's finally strained with that. They still owed it, and they borrowed from everybody to cover their
one after another, and their extravagant expenses in addition to the war expenses. So I mean, these are general lessons, but in terms of the war, I think the evidence does point in the direction of what Ludwig von Mises has written about in terms of how to finance a war, and what's written in this text about how to finance war. Professor Joseph Salerno has an excellent article about war finance. It's referenced in the book, and I believe it came out in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, about financing war and how inflation is a way of concealing the cost of a war, a way of concealing the cost of war from the citizens. But by concealing the cost of the war, it makes it too easy for government to extract resources, and therefore they extract too many. And so that really gets back to one of the main points that we try to get across in the book that in terms of North and South, the North took a more moderate approach, a more traditional approach to financing war, and that was a big advantage over the Confederate process, which, historians are constantly clamoring that the South would have won if they only had this, if they only had that, if we only did more of this, more inflation, more soldiers, more confiscation, more all this stuff. And basically we're arguing, no, they really needed to do less of that. And they needed to take a more traditional approach, curb their appetite. In other words, find another way, a better way of getting the job done. There's more than one way to skin a cat. And inflation allowed the Confederate government to think it was doing the right thing, when I would argue, in fact, it wasn't. And after the break, when we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I would have approached it, how I think the Confederate government could have approached it. And so then we can discuss that. But before we go to break, I want to give a little bit. Well, actually, we're just now ready for a break. So why don't we break here and come back in about 5 or 10 minutes and go into all that. Yeah, I would say that by and large, World War II, for example, the U.S. relied on taxation and borrowing. That would be the case in World War I as well. Although the amount of inflation was probably higher than you would have expected given U.S. involvement in World War I. The Vietnam War, the Korean War was, and the Vietnam War, we were on the Bretton Woods system. So we were on the gold standard, and we were pledged to redeem our currency in gold. And so we were under the table inflating, putting out too many dollars, and ultimately that did cost us. Eventually that did cost us, fighting the Korean War, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the war on poverty, is essentially what undermined the gold standard, and Nixon takes us off the gold standard in 1971. And
what do you think
But listen, Mark, when you look at the percentages there,
yeah,
some of them aren't too far from Greenspan's rate. He's been in there 18 years, and the consumer price index has gone from 109 to 190. That money has essentially dropped in half.
Yeah, there's been a lot of inflation, a lot of borrowing. But the level of taxation is also very high. Yeah, and ultimately the total burden also matters in terms of the mix matters, but the total burden on an economy of government, whether it's a war or not, also matters. And over time, the fact that you have inflation freely available to you means that you have a tendency to increase the size of government, and because you have inflation as an ongoing tool, your ability to issue debt is also easier, because everybody knows that, well, the bonds may depreciate in value because of inflation, but they'll always pay them back. And so when you have, instead of just taxes and borrowing because you're a good risk, with inflation, you seemingly open the floodgates, and the burden of government becomes bigger and bigger and bigger over time. So, that's the wartime example. But as we've seen in the case of France, as we talked before the break, that you can run into trouble outside of a wartime issue. So, it's definitely a problem. Yes.
We were talking about projects that might be generated to boost the economy. Has the South been able to take the war to the North? Is that, from an economic standpoint, obviously we weren't building banks in Birmingham or Atlanta during the war, but perhaps they were building banks in this country. If we had been able to take the actual skirmishes north, would that have?
Yes, I think that it was important not to let the war inside the South as much as possible. You don't want the destruction going on your territory, especially if you've got generals who are burning barns and destroying crops and that kind of thing. That's very bad for your economy. In a number of ways. But I don't think the South could effectively take the war up into the North to any great degree, except on the basis of guerrilla-like tactics, where you would send small bands of guerrilla fighters into the North who would go there in order to destroy infrastructure. So, I think sending the Confederate armies to Gettysburg and was it Antietam were big mistakes. But I think if you sent small bands of Confederate soldiers / guerrilla fighters into the North in order to, say, blow up railroad bridges, moving supplies and troops from east to west, that would have been very advantageous, because in the North there was a choke point in the area of, say, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and resources and men moving back and forth had to go through there, and there were only a couple of railroad lines, and if those lines had been constantly disrupted, that is a small tactic that could have placed a large burden on the Northern War effort. And so, if you're the smaller force, if you're the defending force, you always have to look in terms of what gives you the biggest bang for the smallest buck. And so the idea of bringing together 150,000 troops and, clothing them, provisioning them, getting them weapons, getting them horses, getting them all the food necessary and all this backup supplies and all that kind of stuff necessary for an invasion is very, very expensive. And I'm not sure what it would really accomplish. There was the thought that if you could invade Washington, D.C., get the Capitol, capture Lincoln or something like that, was an old European tactic. You capture the Capitol, you capture the king, you win the war. But other than that...
Chess.
Yeah, chess.
Military chess.
Other than that, I'm not sure what the advantage would be for the South unless it was planning on, burning down a city and...
Except that our infrastructure is destroyed.
Right, exactly. Well, now that we're on that particular topic, and this is something that isn't really in the book, but the book implies all along, that the Confederate government was too big, it was too interventionist, it was using the wrong policies, it was trying to raise big armies, it was, doing all the wrong things, we never really say in the book what should they have done. And, frankly, we're not here in the book to, start another war or, be on any particular side. I'm from New York, so, it's not like I have, as a matter of fact, I probably had ancestors in the Union Army. So that's not the purpose here, but it is somewhat incumbent for the argument's sake, although not necessarily for the book's sake, because the book is about what happened. But what if? What would happen? What could have been the result? And these are some of my thoughts with respect in terms of what Confederate policy should have been. First of all, instead of a large federal army, when I say federal, I should say Confederate or national army. The national army would only be large enough basically to defend Richmond and the capital of the Confederacy. And by that I imply that it would be defending the city of Richmond and a different capital of the Confederacy. It probably would have been better to maintain the capital in Montgomery. Just keep it out of the way, keep it further away from federal troops. And of course, for most of the war, not much would have been necessary to defend Montgomery. And then each state would have its own army. They really needed to defend Richmond because of its ironworks. It was the only substantial domestic iron works in the South capable of providing large-scale ironwork, armor, cannons, things of that nature. There was no city of Birmingham. You mentioned Birmingham. There was no Birmingham. I've got a map in my office from 1860, and Birmingham's not on it. And as a matter of fact, I don't even think Atlanta is on it.
What did it become? It became the iron center of the South much after the war.
Much after the war, that's right.
Might be wrong, I believe 1871.
Could be because, with the Union winning, of course, all those protection of tariffs were placed on the entire United States, so that there was an incentive, instead of importing cheap European iron goods, you had the incentive to find iron, because if you could produce iron goods, you could sell them at huge prices. So, they were trying to find iron anywhere. And you'd have small state armies sufficient to defend the state capital and the major seaport. Just about every state in the South, if you think about it, has a capital, and the capital tends to be centrally located and has a seaport, which tends to be on the coast. So that most states in the South would have a primary seaport and a capital. And these state armies would be there to supervise the defense of those two facilities, so that each state would remain an independent actor. In other words, this would not be a unified war effort. The federal army would have a limited goal of protecting Richmond and the capital, and the states would have their own defense, their own seaport maintenance as their primary idea here. The third thing, maybe the first thing, is free the slaves. One of the biggest detriments to the South's war effort, of course, was the fact that anytime the Union did invade a certain area, they took the slaves, very often put them into the Union Army, or put them to work harvesting cotton or rice for the Union government. So if they were free, I don't know what the exact legislation would be, that they would have to work on the plantation that they were living on until the end of the war, or that they could be placed into Confederate armies, or that they could become volunteers to build forts and defensive works. But whatever it was, give all the slaves their freedom so they're fighting for your side. Yes?
It sounds like a great idea. I'm wondering if it was ever considered.
That's a good question. I think it was considered at the end of the war. I think even Davis, that was one of, the emergency thoughts that he had at the end of the war, that
We were willing to free slaves and there would have been a war.
well, no, see, because we're making the case that early on in the course that the war was not fought primarily over slavery, but over economic policy. Of course, slavery was part of economic policy, but the existence of a large slave population was a big detriment to the South, because it felt like it had to have this massive army to protect itself against any kind of Union advance, which might go in and, take the slaves and put them in the Union Army or to work for the Union Army. So it was a big handicap. And if, on the other hand, you free the slaves and say, you can stay on the plantation safe from the enemy, and then as soon as we win, you get to go free, or you can fight, or you can help build defensive works. All of a sudden, you effectively increase your pro-workforce by, just a tremendous amount.
You take the air out of the sails of the North, Lincoln with his Emancipation Proclamation and all that.
Yeah, and the abolitionists, that was a small group of supporters in the North, but they were very vocal.
Exactly.
A big part of the defensive work would be the militia. In the northern states of the South, that would involve probably a lot of guerrilla type tactics.
Mark, your items 1 and 2, I worked with a retired Marine colonel who said you should never plan an attack with less than 5 times the force you were attacking.
Yeah, well...
It would really put a little burden on the North if the South never attacked.
Well, that's the general idea here, is to fight a completely defensive battle. You always want to have your guys behind huge defensive works, or out in a guerrilla type situation where they're attacking people behind them and, behind obstructions, things of that nature. So you really put a disability, you really make the large armies of the Union a disability on their ability to fight. And the militia would also be used for siege warfare. In other words, if the Union did come down, they would essentially be allowed to advance. They would advance typically to a city and lay siege to that city. Well, the militia would have to be in the city to help the state army hold off the siege. Okay, so the The militia would be activated whenever the Union came into an area, and it would be activated in southern cities to fill in the defensive works that had already been pre-established. Something I'm not really too familiar with, but I do know that the southern states had lots of land that they owned, that they could sell or use for public works. And I would just suggest that one of the things they could have done was to sell that land, if possible, to Europeans in order to raise funds from outside the borders, or to back loans from Europe. I'm not sure how successful that would be, but it would be something in the right direction to use resources that were available to help pay for the war, to get rid of, in other words, government property, is any kind of government property you can get rid of and sell for cash, or in terms of backing loans, would be a good thing.
Question?
Yes, Ozzy.
What about this? If you have each state more or less having its own autonomy in defense and offense and everything, what if the Union Army, you get a big Union Army and you have expertise in moving troops and everything on your railroads, and you can use this huge force to attack this small force, and they knock this one off, and they knock that one off, and just go right down the line. I mean, you wouldn't have a concerted effort to offer to that massive force coming down on you. Well,
actually, I mean, we're still talking about the same number of people, so that if the Union Army did enter into your state and tried to attack your large city or your state capital, what you would do is not offer resistance or much resistance. You would offer a guerrilla type warfare so as to delay and hamper, disrupt the supply routes of the Union force, and basically make it very difficult to supply and slow its pace. And then once you got to whatever the Confederate town was, you would have already pre-established defensive works, and you would have the regular army and a large militia so as to defend this city. And so when the Union Army comes down to confront you, it can't get in, or can't get in right away, and it still faces all of this harrying tactics.
So it's lines of supply.
Yeah, so it's like like wild dogs. You know how they hunt down, or coyotes hunt down a larger, bigger prey. They don't do it one-on-one. They don't do it all at once, but they basically wear down the larger opponent by this harassing tactics. And so I think that that's something that would work. Now, a lot of that depends, of course. Remember from a previous class, we talked about Vicksburg running out of food because they didn't have enough food in the storehouse, but yet Sherman was able to get all sorts of food off of farms in Mississippi. So you'd have to have policy that was conducive to bringing that produce into storage in the fortified cities. So you can't steal people's food, you can't steal people's products, you can't heavily tax them in a way that discourages that kind of thing. But if you have set up a nice protective area, then people would have the incentive to introduce food into general warehouses in those capital cities.
If in the absence of price controls and that kind of thing, like we're actually done in terms of policy initiative.
Right. Yeah. So you have to have the policies that induce enough food into those central warehouses so that this army can hold out. And because you've got a strong defensive work with cannons and things, and you've got enough regular military and plenty of militia, any kind of attack is going to result in, as George said, 5 times the losses of the attacking force compared to the losses of the defending force. So every time...
if everyone is made big enough to crack, pretty soon the other side will just give up.
You know, forts, even by this time, were not all that useful militarily, but what I'm talking about here is large earthen barriers that were still defensive enough against cannons. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my sort of pop military approach. And then also something I mentioned previous was to offer bounties or prizes for destroying or capturing blockade vessels. So you'd offer, a prize for a particular vessel. And they knew who was blockading them. They knew the vessels, even their names, and they were tracked within distance. And so, the Confederate government or the state governments would offer prizes for whoever could find a way of destroying, capturing, or whatever, those particular blockade vessels to weaken the blockade, to make it less effective, and to make exports and blockade running more viable. I would also, in terms of, bounties and prizes as incentives, they also needed to offer prices for needed arms and munitions that were in port prices. In other words, the good was actually in their port, delivered. Very often what they would do is buy stuff in Europe and try to bring it back themselves, and a good deal of it never made it back. It was sunk, it was captured, and so on. So they needed to pay very lucrative prices, but for things that were actually delivered. So that blockaders had a really big incentive to bring cannons in, for example, or really big incentives to bring repeating rifles in, things of that nature. Enhance the profit opportunities of blockade runners. Don't stifle the profit opportunities of blockade runners. And we also might even consider taxing cotton. There was a tax on cotton. And I'm a little uncomfortable with any kind of tax, really. I'm sure there's something wrong with this. And I know I'm either going to get spanked right here in class or get some emails from people out on the web. The idea of taxing cotton in storage. Not food, because we wanted the food put in storage in the cities, but if there was a tax on cotton, say that every Christmas there would be a 30% tax on all your cotton. So we went to your farm on Christmas. Well, that's really cruel. Yeah. That's really cruel. Just pretend I'm from the government. Okay? So I'm going to show up every Christmas at your farm or your warehouse or your barn, and I'm going to take 30% of your cotton from you. Now you are all knowledgeable, intelligent taxpayers. What are you going to do?
You'd sell it before you got there.
You'd sell it before Christmas, right? Yeah.
Right.
You'd sell it before Christmas, but who's going to buy it if they have to pay taxes on it?
And for sale, the prices will go down. They know you have to wait.
Okay, so the price goes down. So what do people do? How do you avoid the tax? Well, that's true. You ship it out. So, in other words, the tax is there to encourage exporting it out. Because what happens? Well, I sell my cotton at a reduced price. You sell your cotton at a reduced price. But George, he's a little smarter than the rest of us, and he sees prices of cotton falling, and so he can buy it. If he can get it out of the country, he buys it at a really low price. He avoids the 30% tax. He gets it to England, and it's worth 10 times that amount. So it encourages the export of cotton. So again, we're trying to run down that blockade force. We're trying to get goods into the country by offering good prices, and we're trying to get goods out of the country, or maybe even get people to start switching over to the production of food products rather than cotton. But all of those would produce more resources for that particular war effort. So, I mean, that's the general outline. Smaller army, larger militia, freeing the slaves, coming up with some innovative tactics to overcome the blockade by using incentives. We're giving incentives to destroy the blockade fleet. We're giving incentives to run things in that we need by offering superior prices, and we're encouraging people to export. We're getting ourselves back into our comparative advantage. Okay, just a minute or two on my sort of pop military strategy here, because I've had a course in the Civil War, and I've had courses in military history, which involve military strategy, but I'm certainly not any kind of expert in this area. But basically, when I'm talking about in terms of a city that you're trying to defend, and of course there's a lot of complications. A lot of cities are on rivers and things of that nature. So there's all sorts of transport routes, like roads, that are coming in and out of your city. The defensive perimeter, and this would be built with, of course, you need a lot of labor, so you'd have to get the freed slaves or the actual slaves, as well as possibly the militia, to work at least part-time in terms of building this perimeter, which would be earthenworks with observation decks, covered areas where troops could go in case of bad weather or cannons firing and so forth. So that your defensive works produce a barrier between the limits of the city in black and the limits here. And then, one of the things I said was they needed to bring in some better weapons, specifically long-range rifled cannons that would fire large shells long distances, but they would be stationary, basically heavy cannons. And if these are placed close to the perimeter, basically, if these are larger, heavier cannons, then can be moved by the opposing side, which is be traveling by land or things of that nature. They couldn't move larger cannons compared to your stationary cannons. So these cannons can fire a longer distance than can the other side. Right? And so, in order to get into range, your opponent, to get into range of the actual city, they would have to be somewhere, let's put the opponent in red. They would have to get in to some area like that, or that, or that. So they would be in range of your cannons long before. You wouldn't need many of these things. And then you could have the smaller cannons on your side as well, so as to prevent any rapidly moving force from overcoming your defensive works. You could have the smaller cannons like they have to stop troop, what do they call them? Charges. And then, of course, what you have here is you have the regular military supervising and the militia basically manning these defensive works. So that a small force with the advantage of these long, large rifled cannons would inflict tremendous injuries and losses on any opposing side that tried to overwhelm this fortified city. And so, if you had the right preparation, the right distribution of labor, which is basically a small number of regulars supplemented with a large part-time militia, you could induce an effective, or you could produce an effective support in defensive works. And even if you lost, you would still inflict many more losses on the other side than you yourself would sustain. Okay? When George said you need 5 times the number of troops, that's because you lose 5 times the number. And of course, you can make it more complex, as armies have done in the past. You can have a second level of defenses in addition to the outer perimeter. And also, of course, the smaller weapons can be moved around the town. Mobile cannons. The horse-drawn versions of the guns, which were so prominent in the war itself.
I believe the South did something similar to that at Petersburg. And they dug trenches and put up some breastworks so they could stand.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it's where Grant put in about 5 charges and unbelievable. And without all that detail and whatever. Anyway,
yes, they did. They did use that at Richmond, and they did use that at Petersburg. And basically, you have a big pile of dirt for most of it. You have observation decks. You have cannon emplacements which are protected, so you'd have to have an actual direct hit to do any damage. And they were very effective. And it requires only a few soldiers to really be on the lookout. And anytime they come, you just start shooting at the other side, and your buddies come to help you. And in Richmond and Petersburg, it was very effective, worked very well. Grant kept, sort of pushing the limit of it, and they kept extending their lines, and eventually Grant ran around those defenses. And because they weren't circular, they were able to do that in that case, and that ultimately brought the war to a conclusion. But it shows that Richmond was never really successfully invaded, and that's basically what they did. And so I think that that would have worked, and I think that it would have been used in more places had the Confederacy taken a more decentralized approach, where each state was more or less fending for itself, as well as contributing some soldiers to the national effort as well.
But wouldn't some states have had many more cities to defend, and so then I could see there would have been squabbling between you've got 10 and I've got 10 and you don't have 10, so you need to help me out along the states.
Well,
there wasn't much to go after in Mississippi or Arkansas.
Well, Mississippi would have had to defend Vicksburg and Jackson, and if you go down the list, most of the southern states basically turn out that way, where they've got a capital city in the center of the state, they've got a seaport. We had Mobile and Montgomery. Georgia had Savannah, and was it Macon? Milledgeville, and then of course they would also have Atlanta, which was not much of a town at that point. It was a railroad junction, and certainly some states would have been disadvantaged And I think you could have redistributed some troops. Say for example, in Alabama we were away from the battle, and people in Alabama tend not to like that, so they may have volunteered for a federal force that was helping to protect Memphis or Nashville or something like that. Chattanooga would have been, that would have been one that could have used better defense. But in any case, those are some suggestions. I mean, that's not a well-developed military strategy. That's just some suggestions of the types of things that I think that they should have considered, and that they would have better represented the type of approach that I'm suggesting here.
That would have brought on more weariness in the North, and then they would have had a peaceful peace. If they'd done it right, like you say, if every state held up their end of it, that probably would have brought on the fact that, well, we can't, we're just killing each other. We might as well sit down and,
Yes, war weariness was that's what the South's real strategy was in any case, because they weren't going to defeat the North. They weren't going to invade the North. What they needed was, there was plenty of war weariness in the North. But if they would have killed,
about it in Ohio, in the book, Mark, I thought that was very interesting. One of the generals that wrote to the effect, and he really was opposed to the war. At least he thought it was a evil thing, and he didn't like it. And apparently, there was a lot of sentiment in Ohio near the end of the war to try to come to some peace.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of sentiment in Ohio before the war. There was in Ohio and elsewhere in the Northwest. Didn't really support the war as strongly as some northeastern states, and so the Northwest, the Midwest, those states were particularly vulnerable, and certainly in the Electoral College was a matter of dispute.